Hello, World History. Today we're going to be talking all about Chapter 13. And we're going to do this in a major overview fashion. So there's obviously a lot more detail that you can get into in your textbook. And I encourage you to read carefully and work through the activities in class carefully. But we're going to talk about some of the main ideas here today, just to make sure that you understand the highlights. If I was going to boil this whole chapter down to a short sentence, though, it would be the one on the screen. So in this chapter, the old world meets the new, trade abounds. And really, that's what's it. We've got Afro-Eurasia for the first time interacting with the Americas on a major scale. And when that happens, trade just explodes all over the place. All kinds of trade routes bloom, and we're going to see all kinds of new products available and interactions happening that didn't happen before this meeting. So how does the early exploration go down? You can see here there's all these different early trading routes that happen, or not even trading routes, but explorers traveling all over the place. And one thing you might notice is that a lot of them are coming from the same places. So a lot here from Spain. We're actually going to have a lot from Portugal too. And Spain and Portugal really take the early lead. Other European countries follow pretty quickly. So places like France, places like England start doing a lot of these early trade routes. So if you look carefully, you can see here that so example, Christopher Columbus is from Spain. We have Ponce de Leon from Spain, but then we have some people like John Cabot from England, Cartier from France, and so on and so forth. So why are they doing this? Why at all? Now you might remember when we first talked about the Ottomans, we saw that they were taking over Constantinople, which was a major trade hub in Eastern Europe, right? Kind of on the edge of Europe and Asia. And when that gets taken over by the Ottomans, all of a sudden that isn't a super friendly place for most of Europe. So it used to be controlled by a Christian empire, the Byzantines, and now it's controlled by a Muslim empire, the Ottomans. And all of a sudden people are looking for another way to do trade. They're not feeling like that's the way to go. And so there starts to be this movement to starting to think about, can we get to places like India, places like China, by sailing the other way? So not by going around Africa, not even going through the Mediterranean and then through Constantinople, but what happens if we sail west? And that's what Christopher Columbus tried for the first time, and it ended up working out. Now he's not as great of a character as maybe you might have thought originally. There's a lot of misconceptions there. He didn't actually make it really past like the Bahamas and some of those island areas. He did go multiple times, and there's a lot of problems with some of the interactions with the Native Americans, but you know, it is notable that he's the first one there, and all of a sudden it leads to this big outpouring of interest into coming to the Americas. Now, if you remember back to our earlier chapter about Mesoamerican empires and South American empires, you'll remember that the Aztecs and the Incas were both very, very big at this time. They were flourishing as cultures. But as you read about in this chapter, you'll know that both of them fall. And this is where gunpowder weapons come into play. So Cortez comes in, conquers the Aztecs, captures the leader of the Aztecs, Montezuma, and essentially takes them over with a very small number of men because they've got gunpowder and the Aztecs don't have gunpowder. And there's a lot of different features there, including obviously weaponry, like we just said, but also disease. These new people coming from Afro-Eurasia, especially from Europe at this point, have some kinds of herd immunity to diseases that the native Aztecs, the native Incas don't have, especially to things like smallpox, which are really, really deadly if you don't have any kind of immunity to it. Similarly, we have Francisco Pizarro conquering the Inca down in South America. Same sort of story. Obviously, there's more detail to it, but with both of these, but you've got a small number of people that basically take out a whole empire just because they've got guns. And so you're seeing just how powerful those weapons are going to be, along with some other things that they hadn't necessarily seen before, like horses, big animals, loud guns. It's a lot to handle, and it's something that they can't necessarily overcome with the technology that they have at their disposal. So how do we even go about doing this? How do we lead to all this trade? How do we even decide who gets what? So when you think about it, the two early people here are Spain and Portugal, and they don't really know who's going to control which part of the Americas. So if you think about it, if you go to a new place and you stick your flag in that place, like how far does that claim extend? So if Spain stuck a flag in South America, does that mean they get all of it? And no one really knew, so they went to the only authority that they all basically listened to, or that both Spain and Portugal listened to at least, and that was the Pope. So with his guidance, they create the Treaty of Tordesillas, and basically they drew one little line here. They didn't know how big the Americas were, this yellow line first, and they said basically Portugal gets everything on this side of the line, so like this little sliver right here, and Spain gets everything west, which is a very good deal. Once they started realizing how big it was, they moved it a little bit so that now Spain got everything on this side and then Portugal got a little bit more. And if you look at what this is covering now, and you think about modern country lines here, you'll notice that this is a lot of Brazil, which does speak Portuguese to this day, whereas most of this area over here speaks Spanish. So it goes all the way back to this Treaty of Tordesillas. Another thing that happens during this time period, like I said, is this flourishing of good and flourishing of trades. So once we have these cultures meeting, we're going to have something called the Columbian Exchange kick in. This is where goods from Europe and Afro-Eurasia are able to be swapped. So this is dealing with crops that maybe had never been seen in the other place. It could be animals, it could be disease, it could be lots of different things. So for example, most of the foods that are traditional to Thanksgiving in the United States, so like turkey, corn, potatoes, pumpkin, cranberries, all of those are native to the Americas and had never been seen in Europe before this time. All of those go over to Europe and Asia. So when this happens, we have a higher standard of living in Afro-Eurasia. Some of these crops just kind of take off. Things like potatoes in Ireland. They take off. They become very popular over time. In the New World, however, although they did get some things coming this direction, one of the things that's probably most notable is disease, as I just mentioned. And as smallpox comes over, along with some other things, there's this movement in the Americas known as the Great Dying, where people are just not able to fight it off. Their immune systems are so compromised very, very quickly with no immunity that we're talking like a decimation of the population. And we see this both with the native population. We also see this, where there's going to be like people would come over and there would be this infection that would be spread and everyone would die. And then the next wave of Europeans would come over and they'd be like, there's nobody here. This is a land that's just open for us. And they're not realizing that it used to be highly populated. It's just that literally the whole population got wiped off and then people left and tried to flee and things like that. So it's not quite as open as they might have thought originally. Okay, another thing that comes out during this time period deals with the African slave trade, where people were literally brought against their will to the New World to be slaves for other people. And obviously this is a very problematic part of history during this time period. And it doesn't happen all at once. So the first thing that tends to happen is when people from Europe come over to the Americas, there's obviously a small number of people coming over, and there's a big power differential there. And what they do is they usually enslave the native peoples. It's not hiring them, it's usually enslaving the natives. But we just mentioned that a lot of them would die from smallpox. So with that in mind, they start looking for a more sustainable labor force, and the labor force that they decide to go with is people that they captured and bought from Africa generally and then brought over to the Americas. And that happens both in North America and South America and the Caribbean. So it happens all throughout the New World. It's not just the American South, North American South. It's all across the board. Typically, these people that were captured, these slaves, they were typically from the interior areas in Africa, brought to the coast by different African tribes as prisoners of war, and then sold off from there. But it's a very, like I said, a very problematic part of all of our history, to be honest. So global trade. You can see after this time period, it just takes off. We have trade routes going all over the place. Both the ones here from Europe to the Americas, including, you can see some of these passages here dealing with silver floor, these deep red ones. See, that trade kind of goes all the way to Asia and beyond. You're going to see individual voyages here and different trade routes for different people. And these goods are just going everywhere. So we went from just interior trade and some slight ocean trade in the Mediterranean and kind of around the coasts of India and China to now it is just taking off for sure, as I mentioned. Okay, so how does this affect the trade and the economies of these areas? At this time, when we're talking about these European countries that are really going for it as far as colonization and exploration. So we're thinking Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, France. There's some other ones too. The Dutch get involved and some others as well. They are mostly following a practice known as mercantilism. And so most of these early countries doing a lot of these trade routes, that's their goal. So the goal is get as much gold, get as much silver as you can, get as many raw materials as possible, and try to make your home country filthy rich. That's the goal. The goal is not to set up necessarily a long-term presence in the other countries or to make them richer in the long run in those other countries or do anything like that. The goal is like get all the money, get it now, just like drink the whole new land dry. And definitely make sure that your country exports or sends out more things from the colonies than you import. So you're gaining wealth. And this is something that they all do. So we're going to see in this chapter, they talk about getting lots of silver from South America and really looking for gold with Cortez and Pizarro. I mean, they're all looking for these raw materials, these materials that have lots of trading value that can make their country rich. But we're eventually going to see a transition to some more modern types of processes dealing with economics. So one of those that you've probably heard of, at least in passing, is something called capitalism. So once mercantilism starts to, it has its day in the sun, it kind of works for a while, we're going to see a transition that comes out of Enlightenment ideas. So these new ideas of how to think about government, about economies, dealing with the individual, and all these sort of ideas from before. There's this guy named Adam Smith. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And essentially, he said, or he argued, that all resources shouldn't be owned by a mother country. Everything should be owned by individuals. And then naturally, if we are all acting in our best interest, if we all want the best deal, if we want to make the most money on our products and get the best price on things we buy from other people, we're going to say that that market of us all trying to get what's best for ourselves is going to determine how resources are distributed. So if you create a business and you make lots of good choices, you might make a lot of money. You priced it right. People want what you've got to sell. It's all going great. You could become rich. But you could also lose your entire fortune if things don't go well. So this is the basis of the system that we use today. It's not all about making the United States richer as a country. Individuals have the ability to make things work or not work. Okay, the last concept here that we're going to see start in little baby stages is the idea of a joint stock company. So as these new businesses are being formed that might make tons of money or might go broke, so individuals are creating these companies, sometimes they need more money than what one individual could put into it. And we're going to see the start of early stocks. Now, essentially what a stock is when a bunch of people own a tiny little sliver of a company. And so companies can raise a ton of money really quick because, if everyone buys 1/100th of it and it costs a certain amount, all of a sudden they have all this money to play around with. But just like with capitalism, now all of those people could make a ton of money if this business takes off. If it's the next Netflix or the next Amazon, those people could all become very rich, but they could also lose everything. So as these new countries are forming and as we eventually move away from mercantilism and into capitalism, we're going to see how some people and some companies become really rich and some fall apart. Okay, if you have any other questions, talk to